Hello. Thank you all for joining today's symposium brought to you by the New York Botanical Garden. My name is Charles Zimmerman, and co-hosting with me today is NYBG's Dr. Brian Boom, Curator Emeritus, former Vice President for Conservation Strategy, and Bassett McGuire, Curator of Botany. At any time during today's event, you are welcome to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Your questions will be read aloud during the Q&A session following all of today's presentations. For accessibility, automated captions can be enabled by clicking the CC button, then show subtitles or view full transcript. You can also hide these captions if you would prefer not to see them. As a reminder, this presentation will be recorded and shared on the NYBG Lecture Library. Now please welcome Dr. Brian Boom to begin our program for today.
Thank you very much, Charles, and good morning, everyone. As one of the founders of the New York Botanical Gardens New York City EcoFlora project, I'm honored to serve as a co-host of the third annual EcoFlora conference. The theme of which, of course, as you know, is conserving the rare plants of New York. Emblematic of this theme is the plant shown on the screen. This is sea beach amaranth, Amaranthus pumilus, a federally threatened species known from only some 50 populations on barrier beaches from New York to South Carolina. I'd like to kick off the conference this morning by providing a very, very brief overview of the New York City EcoFlora project for those of you who may not know very much about it. My colleague, Daniel Atha, and I conceived of the project in 2015 to achieve two complementary purposes: to engage New Yorkers in protecting and preserving the city's native plant species, and secondly, to assemble new original observations and data on the city's flora. Our goal was to create a project to engage the public as citizen scientists to observe, collect, and compile information about the city's plants, and importantly, their relationships with other organisms. Our vision for the New York City EcoFlora was to create a real-time, online, ongoing checklist of plants that would be a dynamic resource for conservation planning, as well as empowering New Yorkers to become better informed about the importance of urban ecologies and who can contribute to protecting them. So in 2015, we organized our ideas for the EcoFlora concept and submitted a funding proposal to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which in 2016 awarded the New York Botanical Garden a Museums for America grant, the purpose of which was to develop the EcoFlora model in New York City. Well, over the next several years, working in partnership with New York City, state, and federal agencies, academic and non-for-profit organizations, and hundreds of citizen scientists, we collectively accomplished a great deal. I don't have time to review all of our project's achievements now, but fortunately, my colleague Daniel Atha would touch on some of these in his presentation shortly. Also, many of these accomplished were amply chronicled in the first and second annual New York City EcoFlora conferences, which were held in August of 2018 and September 2019, respectively. Those conferences, which were held live in the New York Botanical Gardens Arthur and Janet Ross Lecture Hall, were videotaped and are freely available to watch online at the links that my co-host Charles Zimmerman will post on the webinar's chat session at the conclusion of today's program. By early 2019, Daniel and I believed that we had developed a solid model for the EcoFlora that could be scaled up to good effect at other botanical gardens in the United States. And so we submitted another, larger proposal to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The Botanical Garden was delighted and honored to be awarded a 3-year National Leadership Grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services beginning in October 1 of 2019 to expand the EcoFlora model to 4 other botanical gardens and further develop the New York City EcoFlora. This was the grant indicated on the opening slide to the webinar. The New York Botanical Garden's 4 partner gardens for this grant are the Chicago Botanic Garden, the Denver Botanic Gardens, Desert Botanical Garden located in Phoenix, Arizona, and the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens located in Sarasota, Florida. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge this valued funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services on behalf of all five of these gardens participating in this project. Well, we are now 1 year into this grant and things are moving along quite well, despite the challenges of conducting citizen science-focused projects in the era of COVID-19. This brings me back to the conservation of rare plants. And this, of course, is a high priority for each of our botanical gardens in our group. As we learned during the second annual New York City EcoFlora conference last year, entitled The Historical Flora of New York City, Implications for Conservation Action, since the year 1800, an estimated 500 species of plants have disappeared from the New York City flora. These species can be found outside the city, but are no longer found in the 5 boroughs. Another 250 species are thought to be rare in the city, known from only 1 or 2 populations. Thus far, our EcoFlora citizen science efforts in New York and our partner botanical gardens have mostly been focused for practical reasons on common native and emerging or established invasive non-native species. This is because we had to focus on species that could be located relatively easily by our volunteers. But rare plants are the most threatened plants in our urban environments, of course. And so our EcoFlora colleagues in Denver, Chicago, Phoenix, and Sarasota have been invited to attend this conference today with the hopes that solutions will be presented and discussed to common dilemmas in handling data about rare plant species and achieving effective conservation of them in urban settings. Now let's turn to our first speaker to get us going. For the past years, Steve Young has served as chief botanist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. He received his Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Resource Management from SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and his Master of Science degree in Taxonomic Botany from the University of Florida. He has explored habitats all over New York State, inventorying and studying its rare plants. He's the author of the online New York Rare Plant Conservation Guides and the New York Rare Plant Status Lists. This morning, Steve will discuss field techniques and other methods of finding information about where our rare plants grow and how they're doing. Steve, please proceed.
Great, thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me today to talk about New York's rare plants. So I'd like to start out the program with 4 milkweeds that are from New York City. The 2 at the top are green. Well, there's actually 12 milkweeds in New York State, and 4 of them are named for colors. And these 4 are in were in New York: green, purple, white, and red milkweed. Green and purple still exist in the city, and white and red milkweeds are no longer in New York City. And you can see at the bottom right the dates that they were last seen in New York: 1918 and 1900 in Staten Island. So we still want to protect the green and the purple that are still here in the city. So why should we be protecting these species and any rare species that we have? Well, rare species are important because they are usually on the edge of their range, especially state rare species, and they're under different environmental conditions than the plants within the range. So you can see in the upper left, the range of white milkweed extends from Texas all the way up to Long Island. And the plants on Long Island probably have different genetic makeup than the plants in East Texas. So we want to preserve that kind of genetic diversity. And we want to protect the genetic diversity of the species as a whole. They also contribute to the biodiversity of healthy, functioning ecosystems, and they can be indicators of rare ecosystems and provide home or food for rare insects and other animals, and also products and chemicals to people, useful products for people. They are indicators of the quality of the environment that these days are affected by habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, pollution, and climate change, so they can be sort of a canary in a coal mine for problems that are occurring in the environment. And lastly, they're valued as unusual, something unusual that people like to see and photograph and learn about, like the dragon's mouth orchid pictured at the lower right here, one of our rare orchids in New York State. So I'd like to take you back in time just to show you that rare species have been here that have been documented for a long time in New York. And there's been an interest in rare species for the last couple hundred years, actually. And I'd like to take you back to 1843 and John Torrey and his Flora of the state of New York. Now, he was appointed the botanist of the New York State Natural History Survey in 1836, and actually was one of the first, joined a group of people that was one of the first scientists to scale Mount Marcy. And in 1843, he published the Flora of New York State. It was the first and only complete flora of the state. It wasn't a checklist, it was a complete flora with descriptions and keys for each of the species that they knew about at the time. And if we look at his entry for Pycnanthemum torreyi, which he called Torrey's Pycnanthemum, it was described, named after him by a colleague, George Bentham. And you can see on the right the specimen that Bentham used to describe the species. It was from New Jersey. But Torrey had an observation you can see in the lower part of his description from a dry rocky hillside near Kingsbridge on the island of New York, which is Manhattan, which is probably the Inwood area. And at the bottom, he said, it is a rare species. So he was interested in rare species back then, and he had been corresponding with botanists throughout the Northeast and New York about what was rare and what was not and what was common. If we look at his entry for the white milkweed, which he called variegated silkweed, Asclepias variegata, at the bottom there, he described it as in dry woods and rather common on Long Island. But if you look at the places where we have documented historical records and ones that are still existing, there weren't very many places that were documented. That might have been more common and not collected at the time, but right now we only have one existing population in Eastern Long Island in the state. So it's not doing that great right now. Then in 1924, the second state botanist for New York, Homer House, published the annotated list of ferns and flowering plants of New York State. Not a flora, it was a list. And under his entry for white milkweed, he called it white milkweed, he describes it as infrequent or rare in the southern part of the state. So we can see that he was also interested in the rarity of species throughout New York. Then he also started compiling a historical record of plant data on cards. And this was great. It was the first database really of plants in New York. And he would look at all of the specimens that were housed in herbaria throughout the state and look at all the literature and write those localities for the species and who collected them, what counties they were in, and what herbaria they were in, and publications they were in. And you can see the arrows pointing towards the white milkweed entry that Torrey had in his Flora of 1843, the island of New York. He also, on the back of the cards, had maps of the state, and he would put dots that corresponded to those entries on his card. So you can see the distribution that he had, sort of the early GIS here of plant locations in New York. Pretty well corresponds to what we have now. The open circles were reports and the closed circles were specimens. Then in the 70s, Stanley Smith from the New York State Museum started compiling a list of rarities for the protected plant law that they were writing at that time. And he used the 9 DEC regions, and you can see in his list there, he would put the numbers of populations that he knew about in each region. Region 1 is Long Island, Region 2 is New York City, and then you could look and see just at a glance at the numbers what plants were rare throughout the state or within a region. Later on, the 4th state botanist, Richard Mitchell, refined Smith's rare list and produced this state preliminary list of rare species in New York in 1979. And then with Chuck Cheviak, who was a curator at the time, he produced a list for publication in 1981. You can see it on the right there, Rare Plants of New York State. And you can download this. You can Google this on the internet and download it. Also, Torrey's Flora, you can download from the internet. And he also published checklists for New York and started a flora, but didn't complete it. So if we look at the entries from Dick Mitchell's book, you can see his entry for the milkweed family. He has red milkweed there, which he just called milkweed, and green milkweed. For some reason, he didn't think that white milkweed was as rare. And he had rankings of E for endangered and T for threatened. So this really started the ranking codes, which probably started with the federally endangered species list with endangered, threatened, and rare. And then in the 70s and 80s, the New York Natural Heritage programs were started by the Nature Conservancy. And they wanted to have information about rare species so they would know what to protect. And our program started in 1985 in Albany. And you see here, these are our first scientists. Ray Novak was our database manager. Bob Zaremba was our Long Island botanist. Carol Rushke was our community ecologist. Steve Clements was our statewide botanist. And Pat Melhop was the zoologist and director. You may know Steve Clements went on to be the director of science at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden and the Herbarium there. So the Nature Conservancy started these heritage programs way back in '74, and for the next 20 years, they set up the programs within states, government, and other organizations throughout the country. And now there are 90 heritage programs throughout the Western Hemisphere. So our program is now housed, now housed within the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And we have our major partners, the Department of Environmental Conservation and state parks, and we provide information and data to facilitate the conservation of New York's biodiversity, and they provide us with all these other support. And there at the bottom, you can see our website, nynhp.org. We usually work in the DEC and Parks building in downtown Albany, but now most of us are working at home. So let's look at the first plant list that Steve Clements came up with. And here you can see at the arrow at the top, it shows a code G5S3. And then that's a global rank and a state rank. And this was a really good innovation that the Nature Conservancy came up with, that these ranks were used by all the heritage programs throughout the country. And so we could communicate from state to state and from program to program how rare things were globally and how rare they were in the state. There was a federal ranking, and then there was also the New York State protection rank. So to explain these ranks, we have the global ranks G1 to G5 and the state ranks S1 to S5. And those words in the middle there describe G1, critically imperiled, G2, imperiled, G3, vulnerable, then secure and apparently secure and secure, all the way up to S5. And down at the bottom, we also have two other ranks, historical and H, which for us are usually plants that are older than, plant locations that are older than 1980, and X, which means we presume that they're extirpated. So we usually keep track of G1 to G3s and S1 to S3s. S1 and S2s are ones that we usually actively track in our database, and S3s we usually have on our watch list. So all those ranks and all the plants and where the counties that they're located in and the ranks that they have are in the New York State Rare Plant Status List, which I produce every year. And here's the cover for the new status list, which is coming out this month. You're the first ones to see it. We still have the 2019 list, which you can get online, and this one will be online later this month. So one of the things when we start a heritage program, and it continues throughout our looking at rare species, are rare plant historical locations. So we want to go back in time and see who collected what throughout the state, and where those collections were, and to go out and see if they're still there and verify that they still exist or they're gone. So historical locations, as I said, are plants that are usually there before 1980, all the way back to the 1800s, early 1800s. And so we spend a lot of time in herbaria, like the New York Botanical Garden. All those cabinets behind the director there, Barbara Tears, doing a tour here of the herbarium. And all those cabinets contain dried and pressed plants way back to the 1800s and even to the 1700s. So we go and take data from those plants to see if they're still there or not. Now we can use the STAR virtual herbarium, which is really great to use and helps us a lot. We don't have to go to the herbarium as often, and we can look at the plants online. So for example, for a historical plant like Trollius laxus here at the top, you can see there's a location in the Bronx called Lower Jerome Avenue. And before this, I didn't really know there was Trollius laxus, which is a spreading glowflower. There's a picture of it at the bottom there, was actually in the Bronx. So you can look at the specimen online, and here's the specimen with that white label there of a person who verified the identification. And then the original label that is on the lower right, and it's blown up on the right, and it says Trollius americanus, Lower Jerome Avenue Swamp in the Bronx, 1891. So we can look at the map of the Bronx. In 1891 on the left, this map appeared in the New York Times. And here you can see Jerome Avenue, which goes north to south in the Bronx. You can see where future Yankee Stadium is. And the Highbridge neighborhood, which is to the left there. And at the base of that, there was a creek and what looks like a swamp forest along that creek and the pond there, right along Jerome Avenue, Southern Jerome Avenue. So that's probably where that Trollius was collected. And if we look at the picture on the right, this is Jerome Avenue today. So you can see there's Yankee Stadium, and of course that area doesn't exist anymore. So we would give that specimen a rank of extirpated. It's no longer there. But we have found a lot of historical records that are still there, and even in New York City. So sometimes we find plants that haven't been seen in over 100 years. So it's always great to look at these historical records. Also, the rare plant existing locations, we go out every year and survey them. We look at the size, the condition, the landscape of the occurrences. We look at the threats, and that tells us a lot about the viability of those occurrences. And we also look at the trends over time. We've been doing this since 1985, and we take those historical records into account and see what the short-term and the long-term trends are. And our priorities are globally rare, federally listed species. We keep the S1 and S2 occurrences up to date. We look at declining species we think are declining. We also we take part in program-wide projects like our state parks project. We have a project that we did in Plum Island and other areas of the state. We also like to go out to new places where we think rare species might be. And we have GIS people at work that are producing distribution models, and we like to go out and verify those. So as I mentioned, the federally listed species are a priority of ours. There are 11 listed plants in New York. 8 of them are still existing in New York. 2 of them are extirpated and 1 historical. And 1 exists in New York City, as you saw in the opening slide, Sea Beach Amaranth. Amaranthus pumilis is a G2 S2. So globally rare and state rare. Occurs on the beaches of Long Island. Then we get out in the field and go look for these species. And you can see an amaranth in the upper left, an amaranth survey taking place in the Rockaways. On the upper right, we have 2 of our parks botanists. And down below, we have what we're doing now with face masks and some work in the Adirondacks. We look at all of the information we can before we go out. We make maps. We confer with other people like Ray Matarazzo here on Staten Island. We look at iNaturalist to see if anything's been collected recently or observed recently. Here are the observations for white milkweed. And then we go out in the field and take the data using GPS. We use our phones. We have maps on the phone. We use tablets. This is Madison Bowe using one of our tablets. She's a summer intern. We hire summer interns from ESF. And we also take data on paper like I'm doing at the bottom there. Sometimes our phones don't work. We run out of battery, so we always take paper along. Here I'm looking for dwarf glasswort at Hither Hills. And then we also make sure we take photographs or collections of the plants for herbaria if there are enough plants to collect. And then we also talk with a lot of other people around the state, professional botanists like these people here that send us a lot of information during the summer. And amateur botanists like the Summit Stewards. This is a New York Flora Association group looking at violets. Here's a group of people at the Finger Lakes Native Plant Society on a field trip. So all these people are sending information every year to us about rare plants. So it's not only our work. We also look at a lot of lists around the state. Here's one that was made from a Hall of Fame baseball player when he had tuberculosis and was in Saranac Lake, so which I thought was kind of interesting. And then we also have a couple of iNaturalist projects, one for the Rare Plants of New York State, one for the Adirondack Orchid Survey, and we gather information using iNaturalist. Then we put all that information into a database and into numerous databases. We have photos, our photos database, we have conservation guides that we produce. Our field data goes into the field form database, and then that data from our field form database is summarized in our occurrence records in a database called Biotics 5, which is produced by NatureServe. And so all of the heritage programs throughout the state are using the same database. Throughout the country, excuse me, are using the same database. So it's easy to interchange information. And then we make this information available through publications and peer-reviewed publications, popular publications, and also our conservation guides, which you can see the website down at the lower right there. Here's one for white milkweed, Asclepias variegata. And I mentioned in the Did You Know section about John Torrey's Flora. So you can go to that website and learn all about the rare species in the state. So I'd like to end here with Silene caroliniana, Pennsylvanica, the wild pinks from New York City. And we have 633 actively tracked rare plants in New York State, endangered and threatened. And 77 of those presently exist within New York City. So that's a lot of species in New York City. There are 144 though that are historical or extirpated, but some of them may still be there. Since our last rare plant list, we have found 8 historical and extirpated plants throughout New York State. So there's always a chance that they're still around. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was an excellent presentation, very informative. Now we turn to our second speaker. Clara Holmes is a field scientist with forestry, horticulture, and natural resources at New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. Most of Clara's fieldwork consists of monitoring vegetation pre and post restoration and tracking rare plant populations in New York City parks. Clara holds a Master's of Science degree from Pace University and a Bachelor of Arts from the College of Charleston. Her presentation this morning, Clara will focus on efforts in New York City parks is taking to preserve our imperiled flora, which range from monitoring the federally threatened sea beach amaranth, we've heard referred to earlier, to tracking state and locally sensitive species by park. Clara, please proceed.
Thanks so much, Brian. And thanks, Steve. That was such a great explainer of the history of tracking the flora in New York State, a lot of which I was not aware of. I use the plant community guides that you and your colleagues produce all the time, and I certainly rely on the Flora basically on a daily basis, both of which are great resources. Thanks to all of you who are joining us today. It's a real bright spot in this week to be here today to talk about the rare plants and the sensitive plants of New York City, and to share with you some of the projects that my colleagues and I have been working on to gain a better understanding of ways to monitor and manage some of the sensitive species in New York City. So throughout this morning, I want to first take a step back before we talk about the rare plants in New York City and sort of put our work into context a little bit and look at the status of rare plants in the United States, but also the impacts of rare plants in urban communities. And of course, you can't really talk about rare plants, particularly in an urban environment, without sort of discussing the status of our city's flora. And then after that, I'll sort of get into the nitty gritty of some of the projects we're working on, and then end with a bit of information about some of our goals going forward. A recent study by the North Carolina State botanist Wesley Knapp and his colleagues at various other research institutions, including New York Botanic Garden and the Nature Serve, found that 51 species and 14 infraspecific taxa, representing 33 families and 49 genera of vascular plants, have become extinct in the continental US and Canada since European settlement. One of the caveats of their research points out that the lack of plant surveys in many areas and through various time periods drives that number down, and that it is likely significantly higher. They also mention that as conservationists, preventing extinction is the lowest bar that we can set for ourselves. Nevertheless, nearly a third of the flora of the US was recently found threatened with extirpation. And while we have a federal agency that works to recognize and protect our endangered species, it's really heavily skewed towards animals. A recent analysis showed that while 60% of the species on the endangered species list are plants, they receive only about 4% of the federal funding. There are some bright spots in both of these papers, in both Kay Havens from the Chicago Botanic Garden and her colleagues' work, as well as Wes Knapp and his colleagues' work. They go to lengths to point out that there is a huge importance in protecting local conservation efforts and protecting small sites in order to complement the large-scale conservation efforts, which of course brings us to New York City. For some folks out there, it may be easy to write off such a densely urban area as having very little conservation value. But just last year, researchers examining the role of urban ecosystems in plants conservation came to the conclusion that cities often reflect their regional species pool, including the rare and endangered species. So the work that we all do here as botanists and plant ecologists, and those of you who are naturalists and activists out there, is actually quite critical, not only to the preservation of the flora of New York City, but to the preservation of the flora of the greater region. As Steve just showed us, he and his colleagues go to great effort to track sensitive species throughout the state, and at New York City Parks, the Division of Forestry, Horticulture, and Natural Resources, we're working to do this at the local level. According to the 2018 State of New York City's Plants published by the New York Botanic Garden, part of the EcoFlora project that Brian and Daniel manage, there are about 1,339 native species in New York City. Of those species, 312 are ranked by the New York Natural Heritage Program as S1, S2, or S3. And that includes some of the double rankings as well as the species whose rankings are slightly questionable. And for those of skeptics out there that urban ecosystems are not important conservation areas, I'd like to point out that 36% of the species on the New York Rare Plant Status list are present here in New York City. Unfortunately, we don't know the population sizes or the frequencies of most of those species, so we still have a lot of work ahead. And that brings us to the current status of the flora of New York City. Back in 1990, the botanists and plant ecologists, including Steve Clements, which Steve just mentioned, at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden began the New York Metro Flora Project, which, with the help of other botanical experts, produced a comprehensive list of species that were found in New York City and its surrounding counties. It was a vast and commendable effort to document our flora. However, it was not restricted to the 5 boroughs of New York City, which in some ways leaves the most recent flora of just New York City dating back to pre-development eras. Now, of course, the EcoFlora has changed all of that. And it is as Brian mentioned in the opening, it is sort of an online, constantly updated checklist of the flora of New York City. And to complement that, one of the things my colleagues and I have been working on is an internal plant occurrence database. It's a searchable database which holds the species that we have found in our parks, and it includes the state status of these plants, our estimate of the local status of these plants, the source of the occurrence, and the date it was observed. We've included work in this database done by previous New York City Parks botanists, such as Marge Gargiulo and our guest panelist, Marielle Ann Stallone, both of whom have worked and continue to work tirelessly to document and protect our flora. We hope that as we continue to input data into this database, we'll gain a better understanding of how many populations of certain species we have. And I believe this will go a long way in our efforts to conserve our flora. So now I'm going to take some time to tell you about some of the specific research and monitoring efforts that FHNR is taking to document and protect the rare plants of New York City. I want to start with our two ash species that we have, Fraxinus profunda and Fraxinus nigra, one of which is state listed. The pumpkin ash is an S1, and Fraxinus nigra is found in several parts of upstate New York, but is locally sensitive. It's not a common species in sort of the downstate, and much less so in the New York City area. As many of you probably know, Fraxinus species are almost all on the IUCN Red List as critically endangered plants as a result of the emerald ash borer. Here in New York City, the two species of ash were both historically found from both the Bronx and Staten Island, and now they're only known from the Bronx. We've started the process of applying insecticides to these trees in order to prevent infestation by the emerald ash borer. To date, we have protected 32 pumpkin ash and 55 black ash in the Bronx. And this work will continue in the spring of 2021. So this wonderful grove of pumpkin ash in the Jerome wetland that you see here in this photo can be conserved and protected. Out on Staten Island, our flora has an added threat of intense deer herbivory. Since 2017, FHNR has taken efforts to protect some of the species in the form of exclosures. One of these species is the state rare American strawberry bush. According to iNaturalist, this species is still present in the wild in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, with most of the populations known out on Staten Island. In our efforts, we have enclosed populations of the species at Willowbrook, Kingfisher, and La Tourette parks, and monitored the effect these exclosures have had on stem growth and fecundity since 2017. In comparison to pre-exposure numbers, stem growth for some of these populations has doubled, and the flowers have increased by over 75%. In contrast, some of the populations we monitor outside of the exclosures have nearly been lost, with only a minimal number of trailing stems remaining. This seems to be the star of the show today, our one federally threatened plant species here in New York City, which is located out on the eastern coastline of Queens. And it is as you can see in the photo, it is a small annual forb that grows in sandy portions of ocean beaches between the high tide line and the toe of the dune. Its historical range exists from South Carolina to Massachusetts, but today populations only persist in small pockets on dunes from South Carolina to New York. So the population here in New York City on the Rockaways is one of the northernmost populations in its range. Fortunately, it shares habitat and therefore protection for most of the year with the federally endangered piping plovers. This protection is essentially a symbolic fence that prevents vehicular traffic and pedestrian use, typically from March or April, now through the end of December. Since about 2011, FHNR has conducted an annual census of the species. Additionally, we go out to maintain protection from maintain protection of the species from April and through December. We've also adjusted our monitoring and management efforts according to the census work. For example, in 2018, we maintained the symbolic fencing that protects the plovers through the end of December. That extended protection through the period of seed dispersal, and we believe that this management strategy has largely contributed to the record high count we saw in 2019 of over 12,000 individuals. Because the species is an annual, the populations are known to fluctuate, and the natural movement of sand is critical to its survival. Over the last 10 years, the average population size has been slightly over 2,300 plants. Now this year we only found roughly 620 individuals, and we're not yet clear on why we saw such a steep decline in the population. We do know that Hurricane Isaias washed out about 70 plants in the far eastern part of the population where the storm surge overtopped the foredune. But we do not believe that the storm was responsible for the low numbers because the surge didn't overwhelm the beaches in those areas the way it did in the far east section of the population. But we'll continue to monitor the population next year and hope that we see a rebound in the numbers. Back out on Staten Island, we have a research and monitoring project that dates to 2004. It's one of the oldest rare plant research and monitoring efforts that New York City Parks has been working on. Essentially, after a significant amount of development on Staten Island, there is only a single natural population remaining of the world mountain mint. It's Pygnanthemum verticillum. Its status is S1, S2. There are an additional 20 populations planted in natural habitat that originated from the parent population. The species prefers sort of open, sunny areas that are at least seasonally moist and have some degree of disturbance. And the primary threats to the species include habitat loss, habitat degradation, particularly from development or invasive species encroachment, aggressive native species like vines or bunch grasses, and of course, deer herbivory. Because this project has been going on for nearly 16 years, many botanists have contributed to our understanding of this species, including our guest panelist, Marielle Ann Stallone. Over the years, we have monitored stem counts, stem heights, flowers per stem, and canopy cover in a subset of the 20 outplanted populations, in addition to the parent population. Our research has shown us that primarily, as you can see in the graph on the top, stem density decreases as canopy cover increases, indicating that this species does in fact prefer less canopy cover and more light resources in its habitat. As a result, we have continued management activities by trimming the canopy and thinning aggressive associates such as vines and bunch grasses in order to increase the growth and reproductive ability of these populations. Additionally, in 2018, we began a 2-year shade house study in order to better understand how this species responds to shade. Using seed collected from the parent population, the Greenbelt Native Plant Center grew plants that were randomly assigned to one of 3 shade treatments: 0% shade or full sun, 30% shade, and 60% shade. You can see in the photo here some examples of the treatments with the first plants there in full sun, and then behind it you can see the shade cloths that are covering additional plants in order to mimic those amounts of shade. After the first year, we harvested a portion of the plants in each treatment in order to measure their biomass. As you can see from the chart on the lower left, we found that this species tolerates some degree of shade, having more significant biomass under both the 30 and 0% shade treatments. Because this species takes more than a single year to produce flowers and to reproduce sexually, we continued the experiment into a second year. And in the second year of the study, we harvested additional plants from each of the treatments in order to separate and understand the biomass of the reproductive structures. We know this plant reproduces both vegetatively through clonal ramets, but also sexually through the production of flowers. So when we harvested these plants, we separated all of those different types of biomass and measured them separately. We found that the individuals under the 30 and 60% shade treatment did have some reproductive biomass, but it was primarily in the form of additional ramette production, indicating vegetative reproduction. As you can see on the chart on the right, the 0 and 30% shade treatment had the higher reproductive biomass in the sexual reproduction form of the plant, i.e. they had more flowers. So that sort of indicated to us that as levels of shade increases, the plant shifts its reproductive strategy from sexual reproduction to clonal reproduction. This experiment has further allowed us to take the appropriate management actions to protect and conserve the populations of this species, and because it's been such a long-term study, it really provides a roadmap for us in the means and methods for developing conservation and management plans for other sensitive species. And my colleagues and I are currently working to publish some of the results of this study. The last species I'd like to take some time to focus on is actually a locally sensitive species, the Turks Cap Lily. It's considered apparently secure in the state of New York, but there are only a few remaining populations in New York City, and it is only known from 2 boroughs, both Staten Island and the Bronx. You can probably see a trend here. Furthermore, because most of the populations are on Staten Island, we're concerned about their ability to persist under the pressure of deer herbivory. So like what we did with the American strawberry bush, in 2017, we fenced one of the populations and began monitoring this species to understand the impacts and to show the impacts of deer herbivory on this species. To date, we have monitored 4 populations of this plant, though one was only discovered this year, so the data is very limited. Additionally, this is the first year that we have been able to analyze the data because we needed multiple years of information in order to begin drawing conclusions on these impacts. So this is really fresh data, but as you can see in the top chart, the stem density has continued to decrease in populations that were unfenced and has increased in populations where we had fencing in place. There was a bit of a dip in 2019 of the fenced population. We did have a breach in the fence, which likely explains that. But after producing a more secure fence at the end of last year, you can see the giant increase in the population level of that population. Additionally, for those 2 populations that were unfenced, we're afraid that they may be locally extirpated after 3 study years of numbers declining and not being able to find any individuals this year. An additional concern that we have for these populations is that none of them have flowered since we began monitoring. We have done some further research on this species and found that it also, like Pycnanthemum, prefers additional amounts of light. And all of the populations we know of are in forests that are continuing to mature and where canopy gaps are fewer and farther between. As a result, some of our recommended management actions that we're developing include the option for relocating a portion of some of these populations should we be able to recover them. One of the other things that my colleagues and I do annually is visit some of those survey sites that the New York Natural Heritage Program tracks. As Steve mentioned, there are a number of species found that are state listed here in New York City. And we go check on them, different ones every year. A lot of these species have not been visited, or at least have not been officially updated since the late 90s or early 2000s. So we go out and try to track some of them down and confirm that they're still present in New York City. Over the last couple of years, we've confirmed the presence of several species, which you can see here. This includes clockwise from the top left down around to the middle left, starting with Houtonia inflata, which is an S2. Selene caroliniana subspecies pennsylvanica, S2, which Steve also mentioned. The Magnolia virginiana var virginiana is an S1. Sebacia angularis is an S1. And Enithera lacinata is an S1 as well. Every time we revisit one of these populations, if we find them and relocate the plants, we count the number of individuals we find. We assess the reproductive status, if possible, depending on the time of year. And we note any management concerns and threats to the population so that in the future, we can hopefully develop some management plans for these species to make sure that they continue to persist as a part of our flora. So finally, I'd like to take a moment to talk about some of the goals that we have in New York City parks for plant conservation. My colleagues and I strongly believe that in order to conserve plants, we really need to be conserving habitats. That the basis of being able to conserve individual species is important, but conserving whole habitats and allowing space for these plants to persist is the primary goal. Many of our rare plants occur in same or similar habitats under similar conditions, as I explained with both the pycnanthemum and the lilium. So that is one major goal for us, is to conserve habitats. And to that point, my colleagues at NYBG, Daniel Atha and Brian Boom, and my colleagues within my division are working to develop a list of locally sensitive species that would include associated species and their habitats. And once that list is developed, we would be able to take a look and see which species sort of associate with one another and allow us to sort of get a better picture of that habitat approach to conservation. We hope also to keep working towards the understanding of the state and understanding of the frequency of the state and locally sensitive species. And we hope, of course, to be able to increase our monitoring and research for these species and to continue to develop plant conservation plans for individual habitats and species. And maybe one day this will allow us to conduct sort of these informed reintroduction or augmentation experiments so that we can better understand the management of certain species in our New York City parks. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for the contributions that you make on a regular basis to the flora of New York City. I know many of you are participants in the EcoFlora project, and we wouldn't have the kind of understanding that we currently have of our flora of New York City if it wasn't for your contributions. Also, I want to thank all of my colleagues in FH&R. None of this work could have been completed without them. It takes a team to accomplish this kind of plant conservation work and to keep moving our conservation efforts forward.
Thank you so much, Clara, for this excellent presentation. Very, very stimulating. Our third speaker this morning is Daniel Atha, who is Director of Conservation Outreach at the New York Botanical Garden and also manager of the New York City EcoFlora project. Daniel's conducted botanical fieldwork in all 50 of the United States, published one book, and over 50 scientific articles ranging in topic from ethnobotany, pharmacognosy, systematics, and floristics. Daniel holds a bachelor's degree from the City University of New York. This morning, he will discuss how the New York City EcoFlora project has transformed our understanding of New York City's wild flora, combining big data and community science to build the most comprehensive data set ever assembled for New York City's wild plants. Daniel, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Brian. Get the technology working here. Okay, hope you all can see the screen. Great, thank you all for joining us. I have to say how grateful I am to our speakers, Steve Young and Clara Holmes, and the teams at the institutions where they work, the state and city level, for their dedication and outstanding work to conserve and monitor the rare plants of New York. The New York Botanical Garden is an advocate for the plants and fungi that produce oxygen, clean water, and hold the soil. They give us bodily nourishment and provide inspiration and meaning to our cultural lives. As a scientific collections-based institution with some of the most comprehensive botanical resources in the world, the New York Botanical Garden is uniquely capable of providing the community with science-based information on plants and their ecological dynamics, informing management and policy so our planet and our city can be managed wisely and sustainably. The New York City EcoFlora combines the New York Botanical Garden's historical strengths in collections with emerging opportunities in digital technology and community science to maximize the impact on plant conservation in New York City. All New Yorkers are invited to participate as community scientists to observe, collect, and compile information about the city's plants and their relationships with other organisms such as birds, insects, and fungi. At last year's EcoFlora conference, we explored the historical flora of New York City. Clara Holmes reviewed some of the more than 500 indigenous species that are likely extirpated from the New York City flora. Finalizing the list we developed last year depends on examination of herbarium vouchers that Steve introduced earlier for every species. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, access to the actual specimens is not possible right now. Fortunately, most of the herbarium specimens collected in New York City have been digitized and are available through the Symbiota database and the STAR virtual herbarium. Oops, sorry. In the more than 2 centuries since 1800, 54,543 herbarium specimens have been preserved in 97 US herbaria. All of these are publicly accessible through the EcoFlora website and Symbiota. As we learned in Steve's presentation, John Torrey published his catalog of the New York flora in 1819. In that work, he tallied 1,104 flowering plants, conifers, and ferns, the vast majority of them indigenous to the area. The one mugwort species present in New York City in 1800 was an indigenous mugwort, the sand wormwood, Artemisia campestris. The only mulberry was the indigenous red mulberry tree, Morus rubra. Today, these have been displaced and are nearly extirpated by the common mugwort, which we all know all too well, and the white mulberry. As we've been finding out, at least half of the flora present in John Torrey's time is either historical or quite rare. On any given morning, whenever the urge came upon him, John Torrey could walk a short mile to Greenwich Village, past the Newgate Penitentiary, where his father was a warden, and hop on a ferry that would whisk him across the Hudson River and deposit him in the wilds of Weehawken, Hoboken, or the market farms around the village of Brooklyn across the East River. After collecting pitcher plants, white cedar, lady slipper orchids, and other now rare or extirpated flora, Torrey could catch the same ferry back across the river and be home in time for lunch. Tried doing that today. So did you like that? Let's go back, see that transition again. John Torrey's map. This is a map produced by Torrey's, Dr. David Hossick's nephew, Caspar Wister Eddy, overlaid with the current distribution of plant observations in New York City. So we know it was here in 1800, but what about today? what is common today and what is rare. Steve and Clara talked about the specific efforts of documenting these species, but we need a broader picture of the entire flora in order to sort out the rare species. So encompassing 302 square miles of city, even finding weehawken on a map is a chore, and you better bring your lunch and eat it there. And don't count on finding any orchids in Brooklyn, unless you're after the invasive hellebore orchid. But you will find plenty of plants. On the original 1,100 species cataloged by John Torrey in 1819, almost exactly 200 years ago, another 900 have been added from all over the world, so nearly doubled the flora. There are a lot more species to keep track of today, and it takes a lot longer to find the interesting ones, as Steve and Clara demonstrated. That's where all of you and the amazing community science program, iNaturalist, come to the rescue. In 200 years, botanists managed to document and preserve 54,000 plant samples from New York City, all those you can see online. But in just the past 5 years, since 2016, the start of the EcoFlora project, New Yorkers and some tourists visiting Central Park have managed to observe 257,729 observations of plants in New York City. Those are the green dots you see on the map. To the right are the top 5 observers of plants and animals in New York City and the number of observations they've made in New York City. The first 2 you know, and number 3 is Kevin Sisko, NYC Nature Observer. Number 4 is Elizabeth Hardin, and number 5 is Janet Wooten. All of these observations come with precise GPS coordinates and photographs enabling identification by the community, including experts. That's an amazing resource. And with 250,000 observations, we should know everything about every plant in the city, right? It's 5 times what was previously available on the presence and distribution of the city's plants. But is this a true random sample, evenly distributed across the city, all 5 boroughs, and all species? No, there are significant biases inherent in the data. There are a lot more observations in areas where observers are active, such as Central Park, Van Cortlandt Park, and parts of Staten Island. And there are relatively few observations from areas of Queens and Brooklyn, like Queens Village, Ozone Park, and Canarsie. So how can we get more observations of these species we're interested in and from the areas that are undersampled? Now I'd like to introduce the EcoQuest. EcoQuest challenge New Yorkers to get outside, engage with nature, and help document the flora and fauna in their communities. Beginning in August of 2017, 40 different EcoQuest challenges have inspired hundreds of New Yorkers to observe target plant species and their ecological partners in all 5 boroughs. Over 700 people have joined the New York City EcoFlora project, and we are averaging about 15,000 observations per month. Sometime in January or February of next year, we will reach 500,000 observations of plants and animals in New York City. We'll all celebrate that together. If you think this is just about racking up numbers and putting dots on a map, you'd be wrong. Those who participated in the Watch for White Snakeroot EcoQuest Challenge and the Tracking Tree of Heaven EcoQuest Challenge learned these plants so well they could spot them from a moving car in silhouette at night, and even when they were tiny seedlings. They really got to know these plants intimately and intuitively. That kind of knowledge is not learned out of a book. You can't force it on someone, and you can't learn it in an hour-long lecture. It comes organically and seemingly without effort, and this is knowledge that lasts a lifetime. When we see a map of New York City, A native woodland wildflower is not what typically comes to mind. We're hoping to change that, one EcoQuest at a time. From October 1st to October 31st, 2018, New Yorkers observed 16,373 white snake root plants. The number one observer was Elizabeth Hardin, with I think over 7,000 observations herself. That's 1/4 of all the herbarium specimens made in the last 220 years, all in just 30 days. So was it worth it? What did we learn? Number one, we learned that the white snakeroot is one of the commonest native plants in New York City. We have the precise data to prove that. It is most abundant in natural areas of our larger parks, but it can also be found in tree pits, abandoned lots, and even growing out of walls. Number two, by analyzing the thousands of random photos, we learned that 30 or 40% of all white snakeroot plants in New York City are inhabited by Liriomyza leaf miner flies that produce these serpentine trails inside the leaf. Judging by the plant's success in the urban environment, the flies don't seem to have deleterious effects, suggesting that the flies are at least a commensal organism, deriving benefit from the plant, but neither harming it nor benefiting it. What's more, Charlie Eisenman, the world's expert on North American leaf miners, shared with us that most of our observations of the white snakeroot leaf miner, most of our observations of the leaf miner are of the species the white snakeroot leaf miner, Liriomyza eupatoriella, but that there are two other species known from the area, one of which is probably new to science. One of our School of Professional Horticulture students is working on a project to learn more about this white snakeroot leaf miner plant, Elena Peabody. Every year we are documenting one or two new introductions to the New York flora. What does that mean? Are we just looking and finding plants that have been here all along? Or is it that every year one or two new plants are introduced to the New York City flora and we are finding them once they become established? In the 5 years since 2016, we've documented 13 new plants for the New York flora. That's an average of 2.6 plants per year. You can find links to these publications on the EcoFlora website. The New York City metropolitan area is the 10th largest megacity in the world and is the center in North America for trade and travel. It is well documented that the Northeast urban corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C. is North America's hotspot for invasive species. So it's no surprise so many new plants are showing up here. If we extrapolate back and figure that since 1800, approximately 900 species have been introduced and become naturalized in our flora, we arrive at 4.5 species introductions per year, 900 divided by 200. Not all of those arrived in New York City first, but most of them did. So based on recent and historical data, our average of 2.6 species arrivals per year is consistent with historical trends. Before the end of the year, we will publish 2 new introductions to the New York flora. The tropic croton, Croton glandulosus, was discovered in Manhattan by Susan Hewitt and in Brooklyn by Zihao Wang. Addition of this species to the New York flora actually adds a new genus to the flora of New York State. With the help of our community scientists using iNaturalist, we are keeping pace with the flood of introduced species. What about the insects, which we can only assume are arriving at similar rates? Who's going to publish an insect checklist for the city and keep it up to date? It's a question for everybody. On the slide is the Italian arum, a species discovered wild in New York City, again by Susan Hewitt and myself, and published by a team of authors, many from the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, who have taken active steps to curb its spread, a very dangerous invasive species. So much for the invasives and the common species. Now, what about the rare plants of New York City? The September 28 EcoQuest Challenge was fined Fraxinus. That month, one of our longtime volunteers and a great all-around naturalist, Janet Wooten, documented 53 ash trees, mostly in Manhattan. 3 of them turned out to be some of the rarest trees in New York State, the pumpkin ash tree, as Clara highlighted in her talk. Renovation of Central Park's ravine and installation of new paths in the North Woods opened up a section of floodplain that had been obscured for decades by thorny brambles and overgrown willows. Exploring the area after it opened to the public and keeping an eye out for ash trees, Janet spotted some ash fruits she recognized as being unusually large. You can see those on the right side of the screen. Having learned about pumpkin ash trees and that they have the largest fruits of any ash in the world, Janet identified her trees as Fraxinus profunda, the pumpkin ash, and the rest, as they say, is history. Here you can see Janet standing between 2 of those pumpkin ash trees in the ravine in Central Park. The American senna that you see on the screen here is not rare in New York State, but until recently, it was thought to be historical here in New York City. This is an example of one of the species that not necessarily tracked by the state, but one that we are concerned about here locally in the city. Today, we know about 15 observations scattered around the city. This photo by Olivia Asher, a student at Macaulay Honors College, and who writes the Science Notebook blog, was taken near the Jerome Park Reservoir, just south of Van Cortlandt Park. Olivia thinks the plant spread to the location from several nearby plants in Van Cortlandt Park. This August, this beautiful native was also found at the Naval Cemetery landscape in Brooklyn. There are rare plants all over New York City. We should treat every green space as potential habitat for indigenous and rare species, as they are doing in Central Park with the renovation of the ravine and enabling those pumpkin ash to survive there. Removing invasives and exotic species and allowing the indigenous plants to flourish. The field beadgrass you see on the screen here actually requires some disturbance, but not too much. It does well in moist, sandy soil that is mowed infrequently. It'll die out when shaded by woody plants or more aggressive herbaceous vegetation, the same dynamic that Clara identified for the world mountain mint. Field beadgrass is threatened in Connecticut. The genus, Paspalum is a genus of about 350 species in the same subfamily as panic grasses, Panicum. Paspalums occur worldwide, mainly in the tropics and subtropics. Field beadgrass and the thin beadgrass, Paspalum cetaceum, are the 2 northernmost species of the genus in North America. The plants are eaten by butterflies and birds consume the seeds. The cut-leaved evening primrose is much more common in the south central US from New Mexico to the Carolinas and reaches its northeastern limit in New York City and Long Island. It appears to be doing okay in the city. It grows in the lawn here at NYBG right next to the previous plant, the field beadgrass. It's actually a weed in Japan and Taiwan, where there are hundreds of observations. Like the field beadgrass, it does best with minimal competition and occasional disturbance. It's an annual, so allowing it to flower and set seed before mowing will help ensure local survival of the species. This is another species that illustrates the occurrence, co-occurrence of rare species that thrive in the same kind of habitat and thrive with the same sort of management regime that Clara mentioned and that we want to explore further as we move forward. Previously only known in New York State from Staten Island, Nassau, and Suffolk counties, Blackjack Oak appears to be increasing its range in our area. The plant you see here is from Marine Park. I've seen it also spontaneous at Fort Tilden. Besides the invasive tree of heaven and the black locust, Blackjack Oak is one of the native tree species becoming established on the former Fresh Kills landfill site. This beautiful hardy oak is now being planted in gardens, and you can see fine examples at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Blackjack acorns are high in fat and are eaten by mammals and birds, who are likely dispersing the seeds to new locations like Fresh Kills landfill and in Brooklyn. In John Tory's New York, gamma grass was common in salt marshes and wet meadows all over New York City. It was an important forage for deer and cattle. The clumps can get up to 6 feet tall and live more than 50 years. They form extensive rhizomes and root masses larger than the above ground parts. These extensive root systems are very effective soil stabilizers, and they help filter water and provide habitat for salt marsh and estuary species. Unfortunately, much of the habitat formerly occupied by gamma grass is invaded by Phragmites, which forms vast monocultures and drives out all other species with disastrous consequences for biodiversity. Agronomists and ethnobotanists once thought that gamma grass was the wild ancestor of corn, but now believe it is another close relative called teosinte, native to Mexico. You can see the slight resemblance, the illustration there. You can see fine examples of gamma grass in Pelham Bay Park, Bronx. The current geologic era, called the Anthropocene, is marked by CO2 levels that are higher than they have been in 800,000 years, and they're rising exponentially. Sea levels that are rising about 3.4 millimeters per year, with catastrophic rises predicted for the near future. Global temperatures are higher than they have been in the past 1.2 million years. In the Arctic, temperatures have risen 4 degrees Celsius. The sixth mass extinction is underway, with 30% of birds and 70% of large mammals gone from the planet. The insect apocalypse is here. It says so right there in the New York Times. I argue that plants are our single best hope for reversing these catastrophic trends. No, let me restate that. Plants are the only hope. Humans are not going to engineer a livable planet by digging more toxic minerals out of the ground and spewing them into the atmosphere. Only by regreening the planet and restoring the rich tapestry of local habitats around the world will we bring the water, soil, and air into an equilibrium that sustains life as we know it. The more plant species we save, the more bacteria, fungi, insects, birds, fish, and mammals will make it through the extinction bottleneck and repopulate the planet after the dust settles. We can't leave the next generation to clean up our mess and figure out what to save. The burdens are too great for a few global activists and scientists to bear alone. Every community must take ownership and responsibility for their local ecology. Assaults on nature occur locally, or at least originate locally, and it's at the local level that activists have the most power to effect change. That's why we created the Neighborhood Naturalist program. These are neighborhood groups that meet regularly to discuss local biodiversity concerns. And because nature has no seat at the table, neighborhood naturalists act as the voice for nature in their communities. They help educate their neighbors and inform policymakers who rarely consider the needs of wild plants and animals. If you are interested in joining or starting a neighborhood naturalist group in your community, please email me at datha@nybg.org. We'll put that in my email in the chat. The New York City EcoFlora is the first of its kind real-time flora built by scientists and sustained by community participation. With our botanical garden partners across the country, represented by their logos here, we are building the scientific literacy and community engagement needed to protect our wetlands, our forests, and our urban spaces that support life. It is a global model for documenting biodiversity and ecological dynamics to build a sustainable future for the well-being and inspiration of all. We are grateful to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their generous National Leadership Grant to the New York Botanical Garden. Thank you all for listening, and I'll now turn the program over to our hosts and moderator, Brian Boom and Charles Zimmerman.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for an excellent presentation. So now we reach the time in our program for a question and answer session with all of our three expert panelists, speakers this morning. And joining them will be a special guest, Marielle Ann Stallone, who's been mentioned earlier today. Marielle helped the New York Botanical Garden brainstorm about the New York City EcoFlora in the project's formative days. We thank her so much for that. Marielle's devoted her career to saving nature in cities by connecting people to it. A botanist by training, Marielle founded New York City Wildflower Week to help New Yorkers celebrate local wild places. Her New York Times articles and WNYC radio appearances present a greener side to urban living. She's also worked in public schools to address environmental justice issues in environmentally disadvantaged communities. To address the global extinction crisis at the local level, she created Pop-Up Forest, Times Square. Marielle has been building relationships with cities around the world to launch their own pop-up forests. And together, these global pop-up forests will help drive action for the United Nations Biodiversity Summit in 2021. So now let's get to the question and answer sessions. The audience is invited to please add your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please indicate if a question is intended for a particular panelist. At this time, I'd like to invite Charles Zimmerman to rejoin as our moderator for today's question and answer session. Charles, do we have any questions from the audience yet?
Hi, Brian. We do have questions coming in. Thank you again to all our fantastic speakers for today. The first question comes from Jean Linville, and this is directed to Clara. As part of the development of an informed augmentation and reintroduction program, are protocols being developed for collection, storage, and germination, along with the establishment of founder plots for future seed harvesting?
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, Jean, for the question. I'm not sure if you're aware, but New York City Parks has an amazing resource on Staten Island in the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, which works tirelessly to collect seed from our native flora from within at least 100-mile radius of the 5 boroughs. And a lot of these plants that are produced from those collections are grown in New York City parks. To date, the focus has been on restoration sort of workhorse species, those common species that are really valuable in restoration efforts. But yes, if we look forward and eventually get to the goal of reintroduction or augmentation experiments, we would be relying on our colleagues at the Greenbelt Native Plant Center to do the collecting and the propagation for those species. They have been at this for several decades now. There are collection protocols for both rare and locally common species, and we follow strict protocols for our collection in order to make sure that there are enough resources that remain for the in situ plant populations, but also the animals that rely on those seed resources. So we would be maintaining strict protocols. We would do extensive research on the biology and the reproductive life history of those species before we moved forward with any sort of augmentation plan, to make sure that we were approaching it from a conservation perspective, and also not likely to interrupt any sort of other genetic flows that go on in the native populations that exist in New York City to date. In terms of founder plots for future seed harvesting, I doubt we would get there for our rare plants. I don't see that as being a real important goal or something that we would really want to do with these really sensitive species. But the Greenbelt Native Plant Center does have founder plots for a lot of our restoration workhorse species. There's a great ecologist out there, ecologist and farmer, who's works every day to produce seed that we can use in New York City Parks restoration projects of a lot of our local common species.
So much. We had a few folks mention that the neighborhood naturalist is a great concept, and they're really excited about that. So I just wanted to share that with our speakers. We have a question about S1 and S2 species in New York. Joe is wondering what percentage of these S1 and S2 species that occur on state or public land in New York. And that question can be directed towards anyone here.
This is Steve. I'm not sure what the percentage is. There's a high percentage of rare plants in state parks around the state. That's why we have a state parks program, rare plant program. But as far as the difference between private and public, I don't have it off the top of my head. Sorry.
I would just add that.
Go ahead, Clara.
I would just add that, you know, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe New York State is has one of the highest rates of private forest ownership in the country. So there is a significant amount of, you know, forest and in some senses conservation and wild land out there that could potentially hold some of those species. But I can't, like Steve, I can't necessarily comment on percentages.
That's true, and we do have half. One of our ecologists spends half her time, Elizabeth Spencer, looking at rare species on state forest land. So, yep, there are a lot of state forests.
Yeah, I'll just add that many people don't realize that the concrete jungle, New York City, is actually 40% open space. This was research done by Natural Areas Conservancy, published a couple of years ago. Shows that between cemeteries, parks, golf courses, campuses, and of course, New York City parks, almost 40% is open space and potential habitat for all kinds of plants, including rare plants. But New York City Parks manages the larger natural areas. So, you know, a vacant lot or a college campus is not going to be prime habitat for a rare plant, a rare orchid, or some of our other species. That these really prime intact ecosystems mostly occur on New York City Parks Department land. I think 30,000 acres or something like that. High percentage of our good habitat is on New York parkland. So we're very fortunate that the Parks Department is managing these areas and is so concerned and so focused on managing them for diversity and for rare species. So as we learn more about the species, we get better and better at these management practices. And we'll also hopefully be educating the public about the threats from invasive species invading these natural spaces, particularly our larger parks and forever wild natural areas across New York City. So we don't want to be introducing potential invasive species, so that we can refocus our efforts not on invasive eradication, but focus our efforts on habitat restoration.
Thank you, Daniel, and to everyone who was able to respond to that question. On the concept of conservation of these species, for many rare species, Linda says, especially animals, there's a minimum amount of area needed to sustain their populations. Is there any evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, that supports the idea that rare plants also have this required minimum area in order to support an active and thriving population?
Hi, this is Steve. I don't think so. I mean, we see a lot of rare plant populations which continue with very small numbers for a very long time. So I guess it really depends on the species, but and their method of reproduction and how they're distributed. But sometimes we see plant populations that continue for even 100 years in a very small population.
Just to add to that, the parent population of the world mountain mint that continues to persist on Staten Island is in a very small enclosure on the edge of a parking lot surrounded by two very busy roads. And the population has continued to persist there since it was sort of saved by some of my colleagues in New York City parks. So we certainly have the experience that they don't necessarily need large areas for a lot of these species, but they do need the right conditions. For example, you know, a reduction of canopy to allow more light to provide resources for their growth and reproduction.
I'd like to jump in and say a couple of things. I think, you know, what you're saying around the pycnanthemum is true in terms of habitat, but I think you also have to think about, you know, for a long time, those 100 acres in the South Shore of Staten Island were open space, and the population was able to thrive given resources of pollinators, et cetera, that were fed from all of those acres. And so we don't actually know what the consequences will be of the loss of that space because it's been such a short period of time in that regard. And I think overall, talking about, I want to push back a little bit on what Daniel was saying also with regard to parks. I used to work for parks, and I love New York City parks. It's a deep part of my heart, my time that I spent there. But I also think that parks, as with everything else, is a political animal. And it's really important to take a big picture perspective. The way we talk about, you know, what the threats are to this plant in situ and that plant in situ, what we need is political will and money to be able to take care of the plants that we have. And let's remind everyone that, you know, the city's budget, parks gets less than 1% of the city's budget, and it manages so much open space. So how much of that budget is going towards management of natural resources? Very little. So, you know, the natural resources groups are looking for state and federal outside funding. So a lot of this is, you know, thinking about what are the city's priorities, and we talk about these things from a global perspective, but what is New York City doing around biodiversity conservation? Very little. It's mentioned in one piece of legislation, and that was legislation that I personally worked on that was signed in February 2013. But in the latest iteration of One NYC, which used to be Plan NYC, the word biodiversity I don't think is mentioned at all. And I had to
There is
fight.
the nature goals.
Right, but that's not the same
made it
thing.
important.
But no, but that's not the same thing. So Plan NYC started under Bloomberg, and that was in 2006. And then there was another iteration of it in 2010. And a number of people, including myself, really pushed to make sure that there was mention and discussion of biodiversity. So there was a small chapter added. But then, you know, de Blasio came in, it was changed to 1 NYC. It very, very excellently included economic and socioeconomic justice issues, which is excellent. But there is such a thing as environmental justice as well. People who live in low-income neighborhoods have less access to nature. The nature that they do have access to is filled with more weeds. So the quality of the nature that poor people are experiencing is poor. And so all of these pieces are of a piece, and I think it's important to be able to talk about the idea of conservation isn't just about counting the number of stems, which is of course so important, and you know, I used to do that work too, but it can't just be about counting the number of stems that are left on, you know, a tiny sliver of land on the South Shore of Staten Island. You have to speak up and rate your local political representatives. If you care about nature, you know, talk to your city council person. My local city council person just added money in to have street trees cut down to put in a bike lane, because they're saying, you know, we're about climate change and we want to have more bike lanes, but they're cutting down street trees. So we have to align these values across the board. So, you know, I think overall conservation is about caring, and it's about financial resources. And if the Parks Department is going to do its job and the city's going to say that they care about climate change and it's a climate emergency, let's make nature-based solutions part of that. Let's give money to that, certainly more than less than 1% of the city's budget. I also just wanted to, you know, in talking about the resources that we have of who's been doing what kind of work over the years, I want to give another shout out to my dear departed colleague, Marge Scorgiulo. I have one of her books. Marge, this is so hard to see, but this is really old and torn up. But Marge put this together at Kinko's and kind of paid for these things out of her own pocket. And this is a list that she compiled doing research of publications and based on her own field research of what plants existed in New York City. And it's just a really wonderful document that, you know, so a lot of these pieces are maybe not included in what's going on in the EcoFlora, but the ideas and, you know, seeds of these ideas existed.
One other thing that Marge did was she looked at all the historical place locations and where this swamp was and where that swamp was. And it was a really big help in trying to find out where these historical specimens were located.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all use Marge's work. Her book on the cultivated the ornamental plants, native plants for ornamental landscaping. It's a fantastic resource as well. That we all use those.
Yeah, she did good work.
Thank you, Marielle. A lot of folks have been chiming in the chat saying they really appreciate this perspective. So thank you again for bringing so much to this conversation, which we hope to have. We had some other questions coming in, talking a little bit about these deeper issues, I think. This is a question for all here, which I think is important. What are some of the ways that people of color are being encouraged to join citizen science efforts that inform the work that all of you do? And further, what efforts do you know of that are being made to encourage youth of color to pursue careers related to botany and plant conservation?
I'd like to jump in on that if I could. Excuse me. Thank you for asking that question. Great question. So one of the things that I kind of figured out on my own is that it's really hard to get people to care about rare plants in New York City if it doesn't connect with their daily lives and what they see outside their window. And in far too many neighborhoods in New York City, what you see outside your window is not a lot of green. So we need to really push back on this idea of that nature is a destination. Nature needs to be woven into the daily lives of New Yorkers. And again, these are like policy and political decisions, and we need to push, 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 call your representatives. But some of the work, and I know, everyone will talk about this, but some of the work that I've been doing, I left parks, I had kids, I left parks, and I felt like one of the things, as a botanist was there's a lot of talk about too much talk about birds, not enough talk about plants. So I started New York City Wildflower Week as a way to get people excited about plants especially, but natural areas in the city. And we would go out and tour, but the idea was that, nature should be accessible to everyone. And so it's about being able to do these kinds of walks that now, of course, the Natural Areas Conservancy does. They're doing fantastic work. And Clara, of course, can talk more about that. But I think it's also really important to look at work that's being done in schools. There's a lot of environmental education programs, and sadly, a lot of them, in my personal opinion, are really boring and so mean, but they're boring, and they don't touch, and they touch on sort of like global issues and lose the really local issues, like talking about local salamanders, local butterflies, local wildflowers. So there's a lot that can be done in local schools. And I think that's where it really starts. I've done programs in Title I public schools, and the response from these kids is remarkable, and it takes very little to do it. But, I worked with second graders, with their teachers. I did a 4-week course. Second grade in New York City is when students learn about the history of New York City. So it's really easy to weave it into social studies. They're learning about the 5 boroughs. They're learning about the Lenape people. They're learning about the colonists. So you can also learn about the natural resources. We talked about a lot about that. And then I brought them out to Marine Park Assault Marsh, and they loved it. And so few children get to do that because the cost of going to a natural area is really expensive. If you think about it as a family of 5 weekend trip, and they're all using Metro cards. So having them have that awe-inspiring experience is critical. Weaving it into their public school education is critical. So we have to find really easy ways to do that. And I think that's one really good pathway.
I just got Marge's book off the shelf. You can see it here. So I believe this is, you can still find this in used book sites. So I will put this available in the chat as well.
What is the last name?
Gargiulo, Gargiullo. I don't know if I was pronouncing that perfectly, but anyway, just on the issue of equity and inclusion, I like to give the same presentation no matter where I am, no matter what group I'm speaking to. And I try not to talk down to kids or talk over the heads of adults. I believe that the concepts of nature, natural history, and the enjoyment of nature is universal, and it doesn't require, they're very low barriers to enjoyment, should be, to enjoyment of nature. We all have ability to appreciate and engage with nature. And so that's one of the reasons why Brian and I developed the Neighborhood Naturalist program, was because I think that by engaging communities across the city, you will automatically engage different communities. You will automatically get the diversity that you're looking for if you engage those communities across the city. So, and we all have a love for nature. Everybody loves nature. And so I think that the passionate presentation of nature and providing the opportunities will bring people in as long as we reach out to those communities. And I just have to say, here in the Bronx at the New York Botanical Garden, we have a massive education program from preschool all the way up to college, teachers. We teach teachers how to teach about plants. And every year, thousands, tens of thousands of students come through the garden particularly from the Bronx community, but all over New York City for education about plants.
We're lots of great questions coming in through the Q&A, so we'll have no shortage of things to talk about, I know. Maybe a quicker question for Clara. A few folks are interested in, is the NYC Parks Plant Database available to the public to see what rare plants are in their local parks?
Unfortunately, it is not. It is an internal database that allows us to sort of track and manage rare plant species, and it's not currently available to the public.
I think we would have to be cautious about that. There's always going to be a tension between providing total transparency and everything we know about every plant species and being able to protect the rare plants. You know, there are people who think that the best way to enjoy a plant is to dig it up and bring it home and put it in your back garden. What's wrong with that? There were 20 of them out there. I only took one, right? But you know, we don't know exactly what the number is, and these plants should be enjoyed in situ in their natural environment. We should protect their habitat. And so we want to protect these rare plants and their locations from threats like that. But we want to provide that information. So perhaps at the county level, or you know, the borough level, or perhaps the neighborhood even, but providing the precise location of the 6 rare orchids that we have left in New York City. That's probably never going to happen. You know, conservation biologists will have access to that information. The New York State Natural Heritage Program tracks that. Those botanists have access to that information, but it's not made available to the general public to protect those plants.
And on that topic, someone mentioned a question: when observing rare plants on iNaturalist, should that locality info be masked for the protection of those species, or is it better for the observer to leave locality data and then the experts will decide on masking? So do you have any advice on that question?
Yeah, I see the panelists all nodding their heads. iNaturalist is a fantastic resource. It's provided so much data in such precise form. It's just a game changer for conservation and for biology, but it does present some of these challenges. And those of us that are knowledgeable about the rare plants of the city, if you know that you have observed a rare species, it's best for you to obscure the location of that yourself. And we can always reach out to you and ask you for more information about that. So if you obscure the location, it's not available to anyone. But it's also possible for us to obscure within just New York City or within New York State, obscure the precise location of a species down to a rectangle of 28 kilometers. So it'll just show up as a big green square randomly around the location of that particular observation. So this is being done by the Nature Conservancy and the Natural Heritage programs around the state. And because iNaturalist is a fairly new resource, each state is working through their rare plant lists and deciding at what level to protect these. But there are also plants that are not necessarily rare in New York State, and maybe even not in New York City, like ramps, for example, Allium tricoccum. Everybody's probably seen ramps for sale in the Union Square Green Market. Vast majority of those are harvested from the wild. And it's not a rare plant, but we don't want to make the location of those public for everybody to go and sell at the green market. So we're working with the Parks Department and other stakeholders to state to decide which of those should be obscured and which ones are maybe don't need to be obscured. But always it's, if you know the plants, if you're concerned about them, it's always best to err on the side of caution and obscure them. That Steve or Clara or Marielle?
In terms of ramps, yeah, I never post. I mean, when I come across anything in iNaturalist that I know is locally rare, I never post it to iNaturalist. I just don't do it. But I think in terms of thinking about things as locally rare, ramps is certainly locally rare. And the idea that it's inedible is problematic as well. So yeah, those kinds of things to me should never be posted for public information. And I think just the idea of thinking about what's locally rare is, what's going on in New York City is that we are sadly the extinction future. In the same way that cities have the urban heat island effect, and you can see what's happening on a climate change level in a city, you can see the same thing from the extinction perspective, where urbanization is a driver for plant loss, and it's especially sensitive plant species, the quiet ones that live in the deep, dark woods. Those are a lot of the ones that we're losing. And what is happening in New York City will play out in places around Long Island, Westchester, New Jersey. So what we need is to form a blueprint where we say, this is the line in the sand, and we're all going to work collectively to make sure that there's enough financial and political will to prevent any more habitat loss and work to save what we do have.
I guess I would also mention that we have an Adirondack orchid project going on right now with iNaturalist, and we ask everyone to obscure their locations of orchids, obviously, because we don't want people collecting orchids. But we also have a list of sensitive species that we use within the Heritage Program, and we're working with iNaturalist to have those obscured. But it's difficult. We put on rare species on the list every year. We take some off, so you have to keep up with that. And sometimes things turn up on other websites too, so it's hard to keep track of everything.
We had several questions come in and broad interest from our community about talking about the role of Native American knowledge, pre-European information about rare plants. Are there efforts to include this in monitoring rare species? Have the EcoFlora lists from Manhattan been aligned with predictions in Eric Sanderson's Manhattan project, for instance? That's a question that several folks resonated with. And sort of along those similar lines, will there be any discussion of indigenous knowledge around rare species or acknowledgement of the stewards of this land prior to European settlement? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll just speak to that quickly, just 1 second. When the European colonists came to North America, came to the Western Hemisphere, they found a paradise. More biodiversity than has ever existed in the Western Hemisphere. And people had been living here for 10,000 years. So indigenous people knew how to take care of biodiversity. I don't think we know all of their techniques, but I think what they intuitively knew and was part of their spiritual, their worldview was you preserve everything. Everything is important. Everything has equal value. So I think to the degree that we can incorporate that principle and that spiritual connection to nature, we'll get closer to what our predecessors were able to achieve in this exact same space. But Vanessa, perhaps you can mention the Indigenous Peoples Conference coming up.
Yes, next week we have on November 13 a symposium on which will go into this question for some degree. It will be a symposium on ethical landscape, sacred plants, First Nations is the title, and I hope you can join us there. There will be 5 really knowledgeable Indigenous experts speaking about the topic. So it's important to hear their own stories about these questions. Thank you.
We are reaching the end of our time. There are so many great questions from the audience that have come through. I thought we would end maybe on a question of hope in a way. What can we all do through our own lives to make this situation better, to help increase rare plants in our areas, and to help support the initiatives that all of you are leading here in New York State?
Well, for us, it's contributing information to databases and places like iNaturalist for us that we can follow.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the same thing, all the work that all of you are doing contributing to iNaturalist. I know we've talked about balancing the concerns for our rare and locally sensitive species, and I agree with both Marielle and Daniel that if it's anything you're concerned about, go ahead and obscure the location, because we can always reach out to you and identify who we are and ask for more information about it. But the work that is being done with the EcoFlora project that all of you are involved in goes a long way to understanding our flora. And to Marielle's point, just getting involved in your local park, seeing how you can help work cleaning up invasive species or plant with some of the projects that are ongoing is also really, really valuable. And like Marielle mentioned, we only receive a small portion of the budget, and we have a lot of area to maintain, and we rely heavily on the community and stewards to help manage those landscapes. And so any time and effort that you can give towards those goals is very much appreciated.
Yeah, there are lots of botanical organizations around the state too. The New York Flora Association, there's the Long Island Botanical Society that people can join and go on field trips and go to workshops and go to talks to learn about the flora of their area.
Yeah, our partner, the Natural Areas Conservancy, leads a lot of great projects in the 5 boroughs. If you're not aware of them, I encourage you to go to their website. They do volunteer events. They have other kinds of events that can engage different communities in actions in the parks. So check them out as well.
Can't forget the Torrey Botanical Society too.
Absolutely, Torrey Botanical Society. And I would just add that the New York City EcoFlora project was designed explicitly to unite these 2 kinds of data, the stuff that Steve and Daniel were talking about from Herbarium information, the so-called legacy data, I've called it, with published literature, with real-time observations by people who care about nature, the citizen scientists. So that's at the core of what the project's about. So I would encourage people to become citizen scientists if you haven't already. It's quite gratifying.
And
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And some of the work that I'm doing now is trying to connect nature to people's everyday lives. This idea that nature is a destination you know, we want those kinds of open spaces because that's where all our lovely wild flora lives. But people also need to have access to nature as well. So what I'm working on is trying to create a continuum where people have access to nature on the city blocks where they live. And that's part of the pop-up forest project that I'm working on.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have more questions as always, but no matter how long we meet, we never have enough time to get to everything. So thank you so much, Steve, Clara, Daniel, Marielle, and
Yeah.
Brian, for taking the time to share your experience with all of us at the forefront of rare plant conservation in New York State and New York City. Thank you as well for our audience for joining today's presentation. If you missed any part of this event or wish to watch it again, a recording has been made and will be shared online in the NYBG lecture library. And once this is published, we'll send a link to everyone registered today. We hope you'll join us for these future science, conservation, and humanities lectures from the New York Botanical Garden. As Vanessa mentioned, next Friday, November 13th, we'll bring together indigenous environmental experts from the United States and Canada to talk so much about how all of these questions pertain to Native communities and talking about threats from extractive industries like pollution and climate change. Then on Tuesday, November 17th and 24th, we'll take a global perspective on the biodiversity crisis and invite scientists from around the world for a two-part symposium on the topic of plant extinction. For those who haven't already registered for our mailing list, we'll put a link to sign up in the chat in just a moment. So until next time, please stay well, stay green, and take care of yourselves. And goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.